the Story Grows. I'm Brad Patton. Today we welcome Exhumed and Gruesome frontman Matt Harvey to the podcast. The new Gruesome record, Silent Echoes, is out this Friday on Relapse Records. Matt talks about discovering death metal, his long relationship with Relapse Records, how the idea for Gruesome was born, having Death's discography as a guiding path for each Gruesome release, and more. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of As the Story Grows. If you're brand new to the podcast, welcome. Thanks for checking us out. You can find links in the show notes or at asthestorygrows.com for our Discord community, our mailing list, and our Patreon page where you can support the show financially and get early access to every episode. Enjoy today's conversation with Matt Harvey from Gruesome.
Touch your fingers to the glass, reflected back at you. I grew up in San Jose, which is, just south of Oakland and San Francisco. Are you in Florida then?
No,
Okay.
I'm in DC. So,
okay, all right.
Yeah. What was growing up like?
It was cool. It was a very suburban kind of, middle class, normal existence. In San Jose, it still kind of is like this, but especially when I was growing up in the 80s, it's like kind of a cultural wasteland, Mm-hmm. It's like anybody cool that as soon as they get out of high school, they move to San Francisco or Berkeley or anything. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of where all the gigs and all the music scene and whether it was punk, metal, alternative, new wave, goth, whatever, was there.
Yeah.
San Jose was just, the strip malls and, regular old 2-3 American homes. Because I guess, in the 50s and 60s, I guess it was still a lot of farming there. That's what people told me. I don't know. But, so it was just a lot of, riding your bike to the mall or, fucking that kind of stuff.
Nice. Nice. What got you into music?
Well, it was like music was kind of always around. My grandmother was a piano teacher. And my grandmother on my dad's side and my uncle on my mom's side was a jazz fusion, rock guitarist kind of. Okay. Even though he didn't live near me. So I guess I always sort of knew that it was something that you could do, Yeah. And my dad was a big music listener, He had a, pretty decent sized record collection and there was always music on in the house, or in the car or whatever. And I didn't really get terribly interested in it really until about 1987. And that was when I heard, first I heard the Whitesnake self-titled album and the Ozzy Randy tribute live album. And the first Poison album was quite big and the first Cinderella album and stuff. Nice. And I was always more of before that I was a comic book kid, comic book, theater kid. And then I heard Master of Puppets, sometime on the second half of 87. And that's when the switch flipped and I thought, holy shit, because I had changed schools, so I didn't know anybody. I went from having tons of friends to not knowing anybody. My parents were rapidly heading towards a divorce. We had moved the year before, and I had just turned 12, so you're starting to get inconvenient boners and zits and all this stuff. So there was this sort of perfect time of disorientation and change and alienation, and then here comes this really angry record that just blew my little 11, 12-year-old mind out of the water. And then it was off to the races. And then in '88 I started playing guitar, and I sold my comic books so I could, probably in '89, so I could get a better guitar. And then, once I heard Metallica, then I was just like voracious for everything. Like then it was Slayer and Exodus, and then Creator and Sodom, and then Bathory, Venom, Onslaught, Celtic Frost, Voivod, Death, and then on to Obituary, Napalm Death, Carcass, Extreme Noise Terror, Pestilence, Incantation, Zizma, whatever. And it just kept getting more extreme as the next few years went on.
Yeah. What was because hair metal was big kind of around that time, but extreme metal was really just getting off the floor. Was it difficult for you to find other people in San Jose or in the surrounding burbs to connect with, to play with, or that were just fellow friends to be like, hey, have you heard the new fucking Creator or whatever?
Well, it kind of started out in middle school. It was a little bit more difficult. Everybody I knew was really into punk. Mm-hmm. So, at the same time I was hearing all this, I was hearing DRI and of course Dead Kennedys, Black Flag, Exploited, GBH and stuff like that. And so that was kind of all concurrent. But by high school, I had met the guy that would become the original drummer in my other band, Exhumed, Cole Jones. And he was kind of like, at that time in 8th and 9th grade, he was kind of like my sidekick. And now we're both very much, and for decades now, we've been very independent and everything. But at that time, he was kind of like this little kid who had moved to California from Utah and didn't really know anybody. And so he and I were kind of the two guys that were really pushing to find the heaviest and most extreme stuff. Then he went to a different high school, but we remained super tight. And then he had a couple friends at his school and I had a couple friends at my school. And then between that, we sort of started being like, well, hey, I play guitar, you play guitar. This guy's got a bass. We need a drummer. You're the only person here that doesn't play an instrument, so you're going to be the drummer. And, but even then, by 89, the end of 89 into 90, we Cole and I already wanted to sort of play heavier and heavier music, we couldn't even really play much, but we just knew we wanted it to be more brutal and more extreme, and we had friends that were we all kind of like Creator and Corner and Voivod and some of those bands. But when it came to, the heavier stuff, there was some kids that Death was the stopping point. You know what I mean? Right. It was a normal, a hair metal person would have a couple Metallica albums. They'd be like, okay, I got these 2 crazy albums, but mostly I listened to Warrant or whatever. Yeah. And for them, it was okay, I got these 2 crazy albums, Leprosy and Stream Bloody Gore, but mostly I listened to Testament and Creator and blah, blah, blah. And, we just kind of continually pushed on and forward to heavier and crazier stuff. And then, by 89, I started going to shows. In April 89, when I was I was still 13 in April. I know what month I'm born in, honest. That was the first. Then I started going to gigs. We saw Anthrax, Exodus, and Halloween in 89, and then Metallica that summer. My parents wouldn't let me go to see the Creator Corner gig, and they also wouldn't let me go to see the Dark Angel Death Sadist gig that year. Even though Death ended up canceling, as they did in those days quite often. Yeah. But then by 90, I had gotten a job, part-time job. And so I was able to be a lot more independent. I was like, if I can work after school, I can go to a gig after school, mm-hmm. because as long as I show up, and go to class the next day and my grades aren't bad. And then, then the floodgates started to open and Death came a couple times that year, and Obituary and Sepultura. So then we started meeting a lot more kids, our age and from a little bit further afield in San Jose. And that's with Exhumed anyway. That's kind of how we got started.
It took Exhumed kind of a long time. There's a lot of demos, a lot of splits out there, kind of building until 1998. You finally released the full length on Relapse. What connected you guys with Relapse? And I mean, it seems like it's been a great relationship even all these years later.
Right. I mean, I guess to the first part of your question, we certainly weren't ready to get signed, when like us would have been eligible to get signed, which would have been like kind of 91, 92, right when we were very first starting. We were still like, I just turned 16 when we played our first show. And then I think by the time we got to a point where the band kind of had its own direction outside of just like, hey, we want to sound like our favorite bands or whatever, and we had gotten a little bit of competence at playing, it was like 94. And by that time, what we were playing was so out of fashion that labels weren't interested. And so it took a few years of kind of slogging away as a, okay band, rather than just being like a fucking local kid band. And doing these splits and doing these things that kind of finally snowballed into us doing the split record with Hemdale and doing these various split 7 inches. And then basically Craig Rowe from Hemdale, the drummer, he had a label called Visceral Productions, and he did our split with them. Obviously, he did like the first Nile EP, which was a big deal in whatever it was, 96 or whenever that came out. And Incantation had left Relapse the first time, and he had done an EP with them, I think Repulse did it in Europe. If I'm not mistaken, or maybe they got it later. But anyway, he was running a mail order that was kind of starting to take a bite out of the Relapse mail order, because in those days, mail order was a huge thing. It was mail order and wholesale because you had to go to a record store to buy shit. And Relapse was really focused on mail order, and Visceral was kind of catching up to them. But as Visceral got bigger, it became too much work for Craig, so Relapse basically bought him out. And part of that was they sort of had first right of refusal to the bands that he was working with. There was Hemdale, Incantation, Nile, and ourselves were the ones that moved to Relapse. And then for whatever reason, they didn't pick up like Multiplex and Scattered Remnants and maybe another one, I don't know. And also, I mean, the main reason we signed with Relapse, honestly, is they were the only label of repute that wanted to touch us. I remember we knew a woman that used to work at Century Media back in the day. And I was always like, why? Why won't you guys sign us? And she's like, because your band's not special. Like, it's just another death metal band. And I was like, are you kidding? This is back when we used to like spit like live worms on people and like spray like pig blood all over ourselves. And we'd have like, like we'd go to the grocery store and get these intestines, and we would drape the drum set with like animal guts and shit. And I was like, we're killing ourselves, like, to play these shows for like 70 people,
Yeah.
Really, like, there's just another death metal band. I was like, fuck you. But anyway, so yeah, Relapse was the only label that was interested, and which honestly meant a lot and still means a lot to me, because I mean, at the end of the day, like, once you do a couple records out there and there's a sort of spot in the playing field where is there a massive difference between, what Season of Mist or Relapse or Reigning Phoenix or any of these companies, like, what they're going to do for your 6th album. Like, is there a huge thing? Like, is one label going to be way better than the other in terms of breaking your band or whatever? Maybe not. But at the end of the day, it's like, well, these guys cared about us when nobody would piss on us if we were on fire. So
yeah,
I want to work with them, till the wheels fall.
Outside of the hiatus, I mean, you've been playing in Exhumed for all these years. At what point do you decide to form Gruesome and this kind of I don't know if it's a tribute to death, but I mean, this
It
kind
is.
of like an appreciation of, I mean,
Yeah.
you're not a cover band. Was it, did that just coincide with Chuck's passing or like?
No, I mean, when Chuck passed, it was like, what, 2001 or something crazy like that. And, I had kind of, I always loved death and especially the early stuff, but I, aside from being like, oh, I hope this dude doesn't die, that'd be a bummer. I, kind of wasn't really keeping up with death. I mean, I went to see them on the Sound of Perseverance tour because they had Hammerfall supporting them, and I wanted to see Hammerfall. And I remember my girlfriend at the time and I, we stuck around and for a little bit, and she's like, oh, I'm not really into this. Like, you want to just go? And I was like, yeah, we'll just go grab a drink somewhere and go home. Obviously, I had no clue that Chuck was going to get sick and not be there or whatever, or, I probably would have stayed. But I didn't, I thought it was sad and whatever, but it didn't really think too much on it. The discography has always been really, really important to me. But, when he died, I was like, oh, that's really sad. Like, that sucks. But I didn't think, oh, somebody needs to do something about this. It was so new, and it was still at a time, like commercially or in the scene or however you want to put it, death metal was still kind of clawing its way back to relevance, because it was the only game in town at the beginning of the 90s. And then all of a sudden black metal came along. And if you played death metal, you were a dork or an ignoramus or a knuckle dragger or whatever, and then by the end of the 90s, Nile and Dying Fetus and ourselves and like Cryptopsy and Angel Corpse, Chrysian, these bands were kind of being like, hey, no, death metal's actually awesome. Like, there's people making good death metal records that you might want to hear. Origin is another one. And so I think at the time, it didn't really feel like the death metal scene was terribly strong, or that people, really were like, oh man, I'm going to go back and listen to all the death records now. It was just kind of like, well, that's a shame, because I wondered what he was going to do with that Control Denied project. Yeah. And it wasn't until, Exhumed had reformed, and I had heard that they were going to do something with Death to All before it became what it is now, because Eric Greif, who was Chuck's manager on and off again in life, and, was sort of his IP manager after his death, he had promoted an Exhumed gig in, I want to say Calgary, maybe Edmonton or Calgary. I can't remember which one. At any rate, I ended up, I saw his name, to advance the show. We got there and I talked to him, and I was like, are you the Eric Greif that used to manage like Death and like Numbskull and stuff? And he was like, yeah. And I was like, did you work with Morbid Saint? And he was like, yeah, holy shit. And we just had this big conversation. And anyway, I learned that he was working with Relapse, as because he was a lawyer. That's why I was like, why are you promoting an Exhumed gig? You're a fucking lawyer and a band manager. Anyway, I don't know why, but I knew he was working with Relapse, and I sort of got wind that this is a thing that might happen. And I thought, especially towards the end of Chuck's life, I was like, my vocal range is naturally not too far away from that. Yeah. And I was like, if they needed somebody to sing, because I assumed there's like 47 other death guitar players aside from Chuck. So I was like, they'll probably just have like a guest singer. That's like, hey, if you guys need a singer or whatever, contact me if you want. I just thought, hey, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take.
Yeah. Yeah.
I know this guy. I'm not just like cold calling him or whatever. Needless to say, they never called me. And then Stefan from Obscura was tapped to do a part of the gigs. It was going to be him and Charles from Abysmal Dawn. And Stefan's visa did not get approved because this is before Eric started taking over Death to All. And the guys from Sick Drummer were doing it. They'd never booked a tour before. Oh, shit. And they decided their first tour should be a revival of a legacy band involving, two drummers, like 5 or 6 different guitar players, 2 or 3 bass players, 2 guitar techs, a photographer. I was just like, you guys are insane. so, of course, they didn't file the visas in time or whatever. I don't know what happened exactly. The point is, it's now like 9 days before the first gig, and I get an email, and they're like, hey, can you step in and help us? And I was like, I guess, sure. And then they told me, well, we need somebody to sing and also play as many songs as you can learn from the later half of the Death discography. And I was like, fuck. Okay. When I was 14, I learned how to play like Torn to Pieces and Mutilation and Low Life and stuff. I don't know these songs. So I had, 9 days to try to do the best I can to cobble together, I think I learned like 6 or 7 songs on guitar and then the vocals for the other ones that they wanted me to do. And anyway, the tour was super fun. I knew some of the people there, and then I got to know a lot of the other guys like Sean Reinert and Scott Clendenin and Shannon Hamm and stuff, and Bobby Coble, all lovely, lovely fucking dudes. I had a great time. The administration was kind of a shit show. Like, they gave me a check that bounced at the end.
Oh, man.
But they were getting ready to do another one. And this is when Eric stepped in and they contacted me. And I was like, I have a schedule conflict with Exhumed. And, I hope it goes better than last time. Like, I'm sure the shows will be cool and the gig, the performance will be cool, and hopefully, talk to you guys later. As fate would have it, because everyone in Exhumed is a bunch of degenerates, we couldn't get into Canada on that tour because we have DUIs, and a couple of us, including myself, and we ended up doing a fill-in show while Suffocation was in Canada. That's who Exhumed was out with Death to All. And so, because obviously I knew that camp, and at the time we had the same booking agent, so like, yeah, fucking jump on this show, it'd be great. So we came, and then we were hanging out, and that's where I met Gus. And we were talking about Gus was drum teching for Sean Reinert, and he was also playing Baptized in Blood with the band. Right. And I was like, hey, you did a great job on Baptized, that was really cool. And because Sean and Paul Masvidal specifically, they don't play the old songs like the records. They play them like they would play them. Yeah. And we were talking like, man, it'd be really cool to hear like a version of this thing with like Terry and James or Terry and Rick or Chris and, some of these guys that played in the first few albums. And, we were both kind of like, you'd be the perfect drummer, you'd be the perfect singer, blah, blah, blah. And we thought that, it probably wouldn't happen, but Gus approached the management about it. And I laughingly said, hey, and if it doesn't work out, we'll just write our own songs that sound like Death and start our own band. And that would be hilarious. And anyway, then after that tour, I went to visit my then girlfriend, now wife, in the UK. She was at work. There was just a shitty beater guitar in her house. I started dicking around on it, and I was like, oh, that kind of sounds like a Death riff. Oh, I remember I told that dude, Gus, we should write our own Death songs. Oh, I'll just write something and send it to him. That'd be funny. And I ended up sending him a couple songs because, she had to work multiple days while I was there. Yeah. And he ended up demoing them for real. And when he sent them back, I raised my eyebrow and I was like, this is kind of good. Like, yeah. Huh. And then he had the same thought. He actually called James Murphy and was like, what do you think about these songs? And James was like, these are cool. And then Gus was like, well, I'll put together the band here in Florida and, let's see what happens. And so it's a very, I don't know. It's the weirdest like band origin story I've involved with. That's for sure.
That's cool. Does it help you to have that like North Star of like Death as your influence when writing, where it's not like you can clearly delineate like Gruesome from Exhumed?
I mean, it does, and like I don't know. I'm one of those people where I like parameters because that's sort of, even if you are looking at whatever the blank page or silence or whatever, even if you're starting from zero, at least you know where you're not going to go, and that sort of, it makes it easier to sort of get moving. Cause I always find that even if the first idea is terrible, just getting the first idea is the thing that, gets you going and into the better ideas. So yeah, I like it. And I think, it's a fun, it started out as just a fun kind of thing to do that it wasn't challenging because I knew the material inside out that I was referencing. Obviously it was something that took work and it took a lot of care to try to make it as good as possible. So it wasn't just like I just crapped out whatever and didn't take it seriously. But in terms of, I didn't have to really like learn the language, that because Chuck is, he plays in patterns and he uses a lot of similar intervals and certain devices that are very distinctively his, whether they're note choices. There's like only certain kinds of picking that Chuck does. Like Chuck doesn't gallop, for example. And so that kind of stuff I had known since I was a kid because, I spent so much time in my bedroom playing Scream, Bloody Gore, Leprosy, and Spiritual Healing. I should have been like out on dates or whatever. But that's what I was doing, when I was 13, 14 into 15, just playing and learning those riffs and trying to figure out what is it that makes this death metal and not thrash. So that part of it was just kind of embedded in my DNA. And it was really fun to go back and revisit that. And, it was fun kind of dealing with some of the same kinds of things that Chuck was singing about, the Italian splatter movies and the dangerous lost tribes of cannibals and stuff like that. That was really, that felt really like home base for me. As time has gone on, it's still really fun, but it's a little bit more challenging because every album Chuck sort of, so he's got a paint set and he starts with like 4 colors. And then the second album has like 7 or 8. And then third one has 12. And then by the time you're on Human, you're like, holy shit, this is a lot of stuff. So it gets more and more challenging to basically kind of familiarize myself with the musical language of the later Death catalog. And I it's a little daunting because the expectation, I think, with every record that we do gets a little higher. And, nobody, I think, puts more pressure on us than we do. But, we try to be really respectful to the source material,
Yeah. New album's called Silent Echoes. Obviously, it's referencing back to Human. What kind of things, maybe from a lyrical perspective or outside of Human, were you drawing inspiration from when you sat down for this record?
Well, especially again, as the lyrics evolve, it's real easy for me to be like, oh, Chuck wrote a song about City of the Living Dead, so I'll write a song about, some other Fulci movie, New York Ripper or something. That's really straightforward. Even with the last album, with Twisted Prayers, Spiritual Healing is kind of like the dark side of the 6 o'clock news, is the best way I know how to frame it. And that was pretty simple to kind of get in that headspace because God, the news is pretty dark. But with Human, it's a little bit more introspective and inward looking. And, I try to sort of use the things that Chuck was concerned with as a jumping off point. And then I kind of end up maybe expressing myself a little bit more because I didn't know Chuck. I didn't grow up with Chuck. I can't claim to know how he thought. And I can't claim to be like, oh yeah, I'm very like-minded. I have no fucking idea. Yeah. That feels disingenuous. But if I can kind of identify some of the questions that he was asking or exploring and then use that, then it still feels very much like I'm playing in the right sandbox, but I'm also not being disingenuous to not only myself and the audience, but also to Chuck's memory. You know, I don't want to sit there and tell you what he thought about stuff. Yeah. I can tell you that a lot of his lyrics are about trying to find the authentic self and be true to the authentic self. In a world of external pressures, you know, and some of the things that he did that, you know, seemed kind of temper tantrumy or whatever in hindsight. A, he was very young. B, you know, he's sort of this young guy struggling with the pressures of his success and these outside forces of the label and management and this kind of stuff. And that's why he, you know, sort of makes these inexplicable decisions like canceling these tours and stuff, or, you know, going home early from tours. It's about wresting control of your own life and your own expression back from these external forces. Whether or not he made good decisions, that's a totally different thing. But the struggle is about maintaining control of your own destiny, your own, and the stuff that you make that's personal to you. And I think that is an incredibly valid kind of prompt, you know. It's like a creative writing prompt for your lyrics or whatever, because the thing is now, you know, that's obviously different than in Chuck's time, is the rise of the internet and social media and all these things, where not only are people making money off your art and the music you create, you know, like in Chuck's case, but there's literally people just profiting off of, you know, every human interaction on Facebook is a commodity. You know, every comment on Instagram or YouTube or whatever, you know, every view you get on fucking Snapchat or TikTok or any, you know, whatever. There's these massive, faceless, unaccountable corporations that are just kind of turning every human experience into a commodity. Every moment of human connection, they're trying to find a way to insert this corporation into it and capitalize on it. And that seems to me to be a great place to sort of go from this prompt of like, how do you connect with your authentic self? How do you allow that self to thrive? And how do you protect it from exploitation and from corruption, from, you know, exploitative factors? And so that's kind of a lot of what the record is talking about, you know, because I think, you know, you look at a Death song like 1,000 Eyes about the sort of emerging surveillance state. I mean, and that's, you know, at that time in the early 90s, it's like fucking compared to now, it's crazy, you know? So I think that there's a lot of threads from Chuck's lyrics that carry through pretty nicely, and a lot of themes that hold up pretty nicely to explore. And, you know, and then sometimes it's just as simple as, you know, Chuck's got a song about going blind on Humans, so we wrote a song about going deaf. You know, sometimes it's just that easy, but, you know, most of the time it's a little bit more esoteric and you know, but I also enjoy writing these kinds of lyrics as much as I love writing about dismemberment and zombies and stuff. It's fun to do this too, you know? Yeah.
Yeah. The album artwork for this album definitely goes a different direction. Who did the artwork for you guys this time?
We had Travis Smith come on board and do the artwork. The guy, I always forget his last name, Renee, whatever, that did Human. He stopped doing art. And, you know, we were fortunate enough to have Ed Repka on the first 3 records so that they really, you know, cemented the homage. And they looked like those old records. Travis did The Sound of Perseverance for Death, which is a great cover. And after we realized we couldn't get Renee, he was, you know, literally the only option. But luckily for us, he's very active. He's still doing art. And doubly luckily for us, he's amazing. I'd never worked with him before. And it was just, you know, he was super receptive to all of the themes and ideas and concepts, because all the stuff that we were just discussing, and the last question is all stuff that I brought to him. And these kind of images that, you know, sort of came to me from that, he picked up on right away and was able to, expand, improve upon everything. And he's also the first cover artist I've ever worked with where I had to be like, dude, you gotta stop sending me stuff. There's so much cool shit, and I'm not gonna be able to decide. Like it was like an embarrassment of riches, and I'm super happy with how the album came out. Because it was important for the band to signal that we are now sort of moving into the later half of the Death catalog. The logo is different. It's not as spooky, and the artwork, is very different. So somebody that likes looking at cartoon monsters doing stuff is going to be like, okay, this is not that. So in some ways for us, we kind of look at it as like this is our first album.
Yeah. Album's out June 6th. What's the plan, whether it's with Gruesome or Exhumed, for kind of taking this show on the road the rest of the year? Are you trying to tour and play shows with Gruesome? Is that not in the cards? Or
it is. Yeah, we're going to be doing some dates in the U.S. That hopefully will be getting firmed up very soon. And then we're working on Europe for next year. This band kind of, much to my surprise, became a live working band pretty quickly when we started. I remember telling my wife when we signed the contract, I was like, this is just a weird project thing. This is, we won't play shows. Like, come on. And then, lo and behold, 6 months later, there she is with her eyebrow raised, like, So we will be out touring and supporting the record. And honestly, I'm really excited to get out and play these songs. We're really happy with how the material turned out and how the record turned out. And I think, I'm kind of looking forward to the challenge of executing these songs live, because a lot of them are fairly taxing, at least for a player of my generation. Probably some YouTube kid out there is like, this shit's basic as fuck. But that's not me. But yeah, no, we will be playing live, and of course juggling our schedule as best we can around Exhumed and Possessed and Darkened and everybody else's 87 other bands and all that stuff.
Yeah. Because you got into death metal super early, Exhumed started like 1990 or whatever. You've been doing this for so long. Do you look at the current state of death metal and like happy to see it going, whether that's in the deathcore stuff or bands doing the old school death metal thing like Sanguine Sugarbog or something like that, and just like stoked to still see it, like, I don't know, as maybe more popular than ever right now? Like,
in some ways it is more popular than ever. I mean, you look at that tour, that Amon Amarth Cannibal Obituary tour. I mean, we played Red Rocks, dude. Like, that's inconceivable. Yeah. So to me, it's interesting because, in 1991, people were like shocked and appalled to hear this stuff. And then I remember a couple of years ago, I was at like a hipster bar in Austin, totally mixed crowd, tech bros off from work, crust punks, just, alternative people, rockabilly people, whatever, anybody. And, we're just listening to War Master on the PA. Nobody's batting a fucking eyelid. Everyone's just like, we're going to get a Jaeger bomb, whatever. Like, it's just like, oh yeah, this is fine. So it's wild to me that it has become as sort of absorbed into just the greater field of music. It's kind of, on one hand, it's gratifying because obviously I thought the music was great 35 years ago. And the fact that it's still here, I was right. On the other hand, it's kind of like, oh, like you're not angry that there's like a blast beat on the stereo, like guy. It's not terribly loud, but like really, this doesn't bother you. Like, fuck, okay. But I'm amazed, honestly. Like, if you would have told me in high school, that 30 plus years later, Morbid Angel and Cannibal Corpse and Immolation would still be touring, I would have been like, are you nuts? Like, no, come on. So I think it's great. And at the end of the day, there has to be younger bands or the scene won't continue, because we're rapidly approaching a point where, for the first wave of bands that kind of, succeeded playing death metal, they're going to be aging out, playing in a band with Terry and Rick. Those guys are, I think, 58, or close to it. And, I'm not super far behind. So it's kind of wild to think that, there's going to be somebody 60 years old, singing Skull Full of Maggots or whatever. Like, that just seems unthinkable. And so not only do we need new blood if this is going to continue, but we also need a younger audience, because at the end of the day, if I'm playing a show and the people there are all my age, it's going to be probably a pretty dull show because, I don't crowd surf, I don't headwalk, I don't stage dive, I don't go in the pit. I'd stand in the back, sip my beer and be like, that's pretty cool. I wish they played that song. All right. And a whole audience of people like that is not the most fun to play for.
Yeah.
So it's really encouraging and exciting, and at the same time, I guess it kind of makes a weird sort of perverse sense because at the end of the day, like, what are you going to listen to that's more extreme? Like, where is there for anything related to rock music to go? So I think you've kind of arrived at the end. They're beyond, if you go too much further beyond, even like more palatable bands like Amon Amarth or whatever, really you're just in the realm of just the noise or, something that is, it's just not palatable. So I think if kids are looking for a place where they can go and cut loose and yell and scream or whatever, I guess nothing better has really come along in 35 years. Which is pretty sick,
Yeah.